Welcome to the Exit Podcast. I'm here with Alex Petkis. Alex is a classicist and a member of Exit Group. We've brought him into the tent. We're excited to have him. His domain of study is really relevant to this issue of natalism that we're getting ready to discuss March 28th and 29th in Austin, Texas. Natalism.org, go get your tickets. Alex is going to be attending. He's going to be presenting on essentially fertility decline in the classical world. And this is not a new problem. It's not a modern problem. It's not strictly to do with our technology. It's something that the Greeks and the Romans faced and tried various things to address. So Alex is going to help us explore what they did, what did and didn't work. Yeah, let's start with the Greeks. Alex, great to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Kevin. And I'm very interested in this topic of declining birth rates, and so were not just modern scholars on the Greeks and Romans, but ancient authorities were very concerned about this too. For a little background, we want to hit the Greeks first. The Greeks that we're talking about here are the Greeks of the Archaic and Classical period. Archaic is typically 8th through 6th centuries BC, so up until around 500. And then Classical period starts right around the Persian Wars, early 5th century BC, 490, until the conquest of Alexander the Great in 320 or so. Well, some scholars have noted, interestingly, that a lot of the Greek city-states around 500, or at least they've argued, that there seems to be a pattern where various city-states are trying to intentionally increase their population. And maybe this is a response to the Persian invasions. Maybe this is a response to the fact they're constantly warring with each other and killing each other. And that's just a big advantage to have more citizen soldiers you can throw at your enemy. But anyway, Sparta is no exception. They are the Greeks that are probably the most interesting in this context as far as ancient authorities, in particular Aristotle, attributed the decline of Sparta to an inability to reproduce. By decline of Sparta, we're talking about the glory days of Sparta is probably the Persian Wars. This is 490 to 479, the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. That's like Sparta's golden age. And it kind of lasts down until the Peloponnesian Wars, when they famously, Athens and Sparta fight this bloody civil war among the Greeks, amongst basically these two poles of opposition. That's 431 to 404. And Sparta wins that war at an incredible cost, and they end up having an empire for 10 or 15 years. But really, after that, they start to decline. They lose to the Thebans at this famous battle of Leuctra in 471. By the time Aristotle is writing, which is in the maybe the 340s, they're politically irrelevant. They've been overshadowed by the Thebans and the Athenians, and famously, they're completely irrelevant in Alexander's campaigns. They refuse to join the Macedonians, and Alexander makes a point of every time that he can put up an inscription, Alexander defeated the Persians at this site. Alexander dedicated these spoils that he and the Greeks, except the Spartans, won against the Persians. So, the Spartans are just sort of not relevant in Greek politics after around the time Aristotle is writing. So Aristotle's like, well, why was this? And he attributes it mainly to oliganthropy. And this is a kind of a complicated issue that we can get into, but I'll pause periodically for questions, and just feel free to jump in.
Yeah. So oliganthropy, just from the roots of the word, too few men. Yeah.
Right.
From my reading on this topic, which is pretty surface level, it seems to be the case that the Spartans were, of the Greeks, the most exclusive, the most reductive, in the sense of let's winnow down, let's just have the most excellent, the best, which, that's sort of opposite. It's about as opposite as you can get to our sort of present monocultural bent. And you can see a way that can fail, which is that you just get so small, you get so exclusive that your excellence no longer compensates for your lack of numbers.
And the Spartans, it's worth saying, were it was so the story of Sparta is that it's founded by this guy. Well, it's founded by the sons of Hercules, who invade the Peloponnese They set up the kingship, I think, the dual kingship. But then the Spartan greatness period is sort of refounded under this famous lawgiver, semi-mythical, whose name is Lycurgus. There's a Plutarch biography of Lycurgus of Sparta, who is just supposedly this brilliant statesman who made Sparta this completely unique city-state. And one of the ways that he did it, from that inception point, Sparta became essentially an oligarchy where the only citizens in Sparta, the only full citizens, citizenship was very restricted. The only full citizens were basically the warrior nobility. And these were something like 9,000 or 10,000 people, heads of households, who essentially ruled over, by Thucydides' day, 430s, 420s, 2/3 of the Peloponnese, this large peninsula, the size of Massachusetts or something. That might be underestimating it. Anyway, it was big. So you know, and they do that by ruling over these sort of subordinate Spartan citizens who are not slaves, the perioikoi. But then famously, of course, they've got all of these essentially enslaved populations, the helots, and especially in Western Peloponnese, this area of Messenia, they're all helot slaves. And so the system works as long as these warrior nobles can sustain their numbers, and keep the subject populations in order through just outright military supremacy. I mean, these people are trained from the age of 7 to be the toughest guys on the planet. And it kind of works, but then they have this issue over the classical period of declining numbers. So it's worth pointing out that Sparta, the way that Lycurgus, according to the story that Plutarch tells, set it up, that every Spartan noble should have an equal plot of land. So one of the things that he did when he started his reforms was to redistribute all the land. Apparently he got buy-in from this to equal plots, one plot for every Spartiate, which is the warrior noble citizen, family member, head of household rather. And then these were supposed to be kept in primogeniture, undivided through the centuries, to keep the number of Spartan equals, as they're called, the homoioi, the similar to each other guys. So there's this really strict egalitarianism among the warrior nobility, just with restricted to the citizenry, and this is the system that we see kind of breaking down in the 5th and 4th centuries.
So the Spartiates, the homoioi, are those so like if you are a Spartan and you have 3 kids, only one of them becomes a citizen? Three sons?
So it's kind of unclear how they did it. It's debated, but the idea would be only one of them inherits the estate, but the state will do their best to try to make arrangements for the others. So for example, you take casualties in battle, some of the households lose their paterfamilias, their heir. Then the authorities can give the wife of one of these guys in marriage to, a deserving young second or third son. Something that's what is hypothesized to make sense of this. So something like that. But there's a chance that some of them, and we do have these stories of the founding of Thera of Santorini it was a Spartan colony. I think Milos was a Spartan colony. Cyrene is a Spartan colony. So that's another way to relieve the pressure. You just send these third and fourth sons out to colonize some other area, but ideally the primogeniture keeps those estates intact. Is the key point. Right,
and so you're competing for a legally, formally limited supply of sovereignty, sort of. There's incentive to keep everything lean and small and tight, and so you can see why that would lead to problems, and also it's sort of the society that seems to me to be the most almost definitionally right wing. It's about as right wing as you can possibly be, because it's openly, nakedly eugenic. It's absolutely about the strong over the weak, and it's absolutely about excellence, and so it's sort of emblematic of the success and failure mode of sort of that temperament or that way of thinking. One of the things that I think is interesting about it, well, maybe you can tell me if this is even true, but what I have seen and read about this is that, like, while the Athenians, they sort of classically had their flowering and then decadence and sort of lost the vibe. They stopped being who they were. Similarly, the Romans, this collapse into sort of admixture and mercenary armies and who are we anymore? The Spartans kind of rode the train all the way into the ground. Like they stayed Spartans all the way through. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's fair. And in the Hellenistic period, they just get smaller and smaller and less relevant. Plutarch documents this in the life of Agis and Cleomenes, who he compares with the Gracchi, who are these kind of tragic kings who try to make some reforms to increase the number of Spartiates, and they do actually successfully some land redistribution. But it's sort of, I guess by that point it sort of felt that if you change too much, then Sparta isn't Sparta anymore. And they end up with a tyrant by the time the Romans take over Greece, and they depose the tyrant, and Sparta kind of becomes a theme park after that for Roman visitors, to see the youth getting whipped and not crying and all this stuff. But maybe it's worth
that almost sounds modern. Can you say more about that, the theme park?
Yeah, so the Romans admired Sparta more than any of the Greek city-states, and they saw themselves in the Spartans in so many ways. And in Plutarch's day, the Romans, like, they kind of subsidize Sparta. I believe it's like a free city; they don't have to pay tax. And Roman men of letters and governors and sophisticates are like, they travel Greece on their own kind of version of the grand tour. They want to see where Pericles spoke and where Socrates walked in Athens. But in Sparta, and there still are philosophers in Athens and orators, and they'll teach you rhetoric for a nice fee. But in Sparta, they have this living tradition of keeping a lot of the agoge, the famous education system. They keep aspects of it intact. And I can't remember if this is in Sparta, like in the classical period, or if it's supposed to be something that a Roman traveler witnessed. But it's like, there was a weasel in some kid's cloak, and during this ritual, and if you make a peep or anything, then you get whipped, and more importantly, you get shamed for breaking your concentration. So this weasel like devoured this kid's guts, and he like died standing there rather than say something about, hey, there's a weasel in my tunic and I'm getting eaten alive here. and so there's all this stuff like that, stories about the Spartan youth getting they train naked, which is very novel to the Romans, as Plutarch talks about in this passage that we'll discuss in a sec. So it's kind of an unworthy end, but I guess they were serving this symbolic purpose for the Romans of like, there still are men like this, or look at the what cultivation can do. Look at what we Romans can achieve if we just double down on our excellent past. Yeah.
Well, it's almost that story of the weasel eating the kid's guts. It's almost just a metaphor of like stasis, there are failure modes there. Yeah, right. Like don't do anything, don't move. Like the rules, the value of discipline, the value of the rules, and also the failure mode of those rules becoming just completely entrenched. And I think, and of course, like in our society, we have like the opposite problem. So like it's maybe a little bit silly to critique that too harshly and shake our finger at it when we're in a state of complete dissolution. But in terms of like the star that you're sailing by, right? And maybe this is interesting, like with the Romans, like the Romans are they're not Spartans, but they are sort of they're taking an eyedropper of that Spartanness. They're taking inspiration from it without slavishly replicating it. And that, and that's maybe part of their robustness and what they're able to accomplish that like the actual Spartans of the time are not able to accomplish.
Yeah, you can't help but, and the Romans certainly thought of themselves as they would have thought of themselves as kind of more flexible than the Spartans, and sort of militarily superior, partly because of their flexibility. They were just as tough, but wise enough to know the limits, and so I think part of their ritual of going to tour Sparta and seeing what the evidence of what is their confirming their own superiority, right? Admiring and yet thereby noting that these people are our subjects now, right? It's just very just a thrilling prospect, I think, for a Roman noble.
Right.
But why don't we look at some passages from the life of Lycurgus, because I think Sparta is worth dwelling on as we have a lot of evidence for how they liked to think different with their
let's do that.
Marriage and birth practices. So here's what Plutarch says in the life of Lycurgus, and some of this is, this is all debated, but let's take it as historical. He says, in the matter of education, which, this is chapter 14 for what it's worth, in the matter of education which Lycurgus regarded as the greatest and noblest task of the lawgiver, he began at the very source by carefully regulating marriages and births. Even to the women, Lycurgus paid all possible attention. He made the maidens exercise their bodies in running, wrestling, casting the discus, and hurling the javelin, in order that the fruit of their wombs might have vigorous root in vigorous bodies and come to better maturity, and that they themselves might come with vigor to the fullness of their times and struggle successfully and easily with the pangs of childbirth. So famously, the Spartan women also trained, here, we'll get a little further on here. He freed them from softness and delicacy and all effeminacy by accustoming the maidens, no less than the youths, the male youths, to go naked in processions, and at certain festivals to dance and sing when the young men were present as spectators. And so, the women and boys are processing naked, apparently. I mean, this is debated a little bit. The Loeb edition, the green and Greek-facing English edition, the translator translates the Greek word for naked as with tunics only. So I don't know if that's a kind of a Baudelarization, or if the author actually believed that that by naked, Plutarch didn't mean naked. There's some debate there. But there is ample evidence that gymnastics were done like properly naked, like stark naked, in the classical and archaic periods. And it's important to understand the rationale for this. Like, this is seen as a very egalitarian practice. This is one of the reasons, and it's very democratic too. Like you can see how in a place like Athens, in particular, training naked at the gymnasium, it removes all of the marks of fancier clothes or bodily adornments, and it kind of levels the classes amongst themselves. But I think it's interesting.
But it also reveals the natural distinctions, right? Like it's not purely egalitarian. Like Odysseus showing up naked on the seashore, but his kingly bearing is still so apparent. It's not egalitarian in the sense that we're all the same on the inside. It's egalitarian in the sense of it's like pure. I know this is a dirty word now, but meritocracy, right? Aristocracy, right? The best.
The physical specimens.
Exposed, right? You are exposed as what you are.
Yeah. That you can't hide your inferiority with your wealth or your ability to wheedle your way up in a courtly fashion. It's all about are you fit for the real service of the state, which is of course warfare. And I think it's what I was going to say is I think it's interesting that Plutarch, it's sort of well known that Spartan women would train as well. But Plutarch says this is because Lycurgus wanted them to be really, really good at bearing children. That was the priority. And Xenophon actually, in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, another interesting text on this, he talks about how in other Greek city-states, women are expected to be, economic producers. They're supposed to spin wool and weave and make clothes. And, it's important to note that, pre-modern economy, women served a big economic role, but it was just within the household. But Xenophon says Lycurgus thought that for the Spartan noblewomen, all that could be done by slaves, and their primary job was to train themselves so that they could bear better children. So that's kind of make more Spartans. That was their number one duty. So yeah.
Well,
going on.
And I mean, like on this topic, like it seems like we are learning now how significant the fetal environment is to just like the life outcomes for kids, and that places a lot of pressure on. I definitely know that like moms that I know have tons of anxiety about like am I feeding my kid the right thing in the womb and all this stuff. I think well, it's interesting to wonder like how much difference did that make in terms of like actual outcomes, the effort put into not to be indelicate, but the vessel, right? And the idea basically that somebody just thousands of years ago would have kind of the same, or they would like sort of know things that we're just rediscovering. They actually matter quite a lot. Yeah,
and I mean, I do believe it's probably right that just physical fitness makes you more resilient. Gosh, before modern medicine, this is an incredibly, incredibly hazardous thing to do, bear children, right? Like, it's like probably the number one cause of death of women. So there is some wisdom to that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So should we move on a little bit?
Yeah.
And I think that this is Plutarch just puts a little period on here with this paragraph about don't think that this made the Spartans lascivious, nor was there anything disgraceful in the scant clothing, or nakedness rather, of the maidens. For modesty attended them, and wantonness was banished. Nay, rather it produced in them habits of simplicity and an ardent desire for health and beauty of body. He means rather than putting on makeup and wearing nice dresses, just fitness. It gave them all above board. Yeah, it gave also to womankind a taste of lofty sentiment, for they felt that they too had a place in the arena of bravery and ambition. I think that's really interesting. Wherefore they were led to think and speak as Gorgo, the wife of Leonidas, of the 300, is said to have done, when some foreign woman, as it would seem, said to her, "You Spartan women are the only ones who rule their men." She answered, "Yes, we are the only ones that give birth to men." So there was a kind of a martial pride even in the women at Sparta, according to this account.
Yeah, well, and it seems like they also got up to some weird, like some of the eugenics stuff. If I remember right, it's like, some of these guys were like sending their wives to like some other dude who might give a better baby.
Yes,
is that right?
Yeah, well, we could. We're gonna get there in a little bit in the Plutarch.
Okay, passage. No, stay on your track.
Yeah, so. So before we get there, Lycurgus, I think I mentioned this, he puts a stigma on confirmed bachelors. Yeah, he makes them do this this embarrassing ritual where they have to, if you're not married once a year, you have to like march through the town square naked, and then sing some song about yourself, about how you're all, we're disobedient to the laws, shame on us. It's like, so they really turn up the pressure there on men. So there's all this pressure on men to have children, and so, but here's how he describes the wedding ceremony, if you can call it that. Listen to this. For their marriages, women were carried off by force. Not when they were small and unfit for wedlock, though, but when they were in full bloom and wholly ripe. So, they're not getting married at 12 or 14 like in other city-states, but I guess 18 or 20. After the woman was thus carried off, that's how they do it, the bridesmaid, so-called, took her in charge, cut her hair off close to the head, put a man's cloak and sandals on her, and laid her down on a pallet on the floor, alone in the dark. I'm sure the anthropologists have had fun with that. It's kind of like a rebirth or something through liminal, gender confusion.
So what do you make of, so what I've heard, just like the pop interpretation of that is like, well, these fellas were pretty used to fellas.
Right.
And they were trying to ease them into to hanging out with ladies. What do you think about that?
Plutarch really likes to downplay the risks of homosexuality in Spartans who he admires, and the Thebans too, whom he admires. But let's admit that's when you get a bunch of guys together and you deprive them of women, this sort of thing happens. So they're not used to hanging out with women. But Plutarch has a good explanation for how this is a good thing. So going on here. Then the bridegroom, not flown with wine, nor enfeebled by excesses, but composed and sober, after supping at his public mess table as usual, so that they have communal dining among the men, right? That's the standard. He slips stealthily into the room where the bride lay, and bears her to the marriage bed. Then, after spending a short time with his bride, he went away composedly to his usual quarters, there to sleep with the other young men. So they don't actually cohabit. And she goes back, basically he sneaks into her house and they do their business. And then he has to sneak out and not get caught because it's a great shame to get caught. And this they did not for a short time only, but long enough for some of them to become fathers before they had looked upon their own wives by daylight. So they're not even seen in public in many cases until they have children. Such interviews, but here's the explanation of why this is good. They not only brought into exercise self-restraint and moderation, but united husbands and wives when their bodies were full of creative energy and their affections new and fresh, not when they were sated and dulled by unrestricted intercourse. There was always left behind in their hearts some residual spark of longing and delight. So... Okay.
So you're keeping the spice,
fire. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, and the secrecy. It's all there to kind of and there's this idea that the moment of procreation and the circumstance of it have a big impact on the results. So I don't know. I can't remember the specifics, but there's lots of ancient stories of the mother sees a painting of a bull, for example, on the wall during the moment that the baby is conceived, and then he ends up kind of having a kind of bullish nature, and so because they don't totally get genetics and how all these recessive and dominant genes work. There's this sense that that's a really crucial moment, managing how that happens and what inputs go into the situation is really crucial.
I mean, did they sort of have some notion of vril, your essence? You got to conserve your essence.
I think, totally. That how else could you explain it? Your mojo, you have more mojo when you're 25 than when you're 40, and that Plutarch talks about this, or is it Plutarch or Xenophon? How they're trying to get the the young men to have children when they're young. It's understood that the women would be having children when they're young, but like the crucial innovation with Sparta is like they're actually getting the young men to have children, and they're balancing it out, I think, interestingly, by the fact that like these guys don't have to live with their wives for many years, even if they're married. It's more about producing these children, and that's balanced also by, I think we'll get to in a second, which is this idea of the sons are the kind of the sons of the state rather than the sons of a family, in some sense.
Yeah, and it's another thing where it's like, you know, and this is not an endorsement of any of this, but it's like,
sure,
it's interesting that there was elements of, and it just, I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense where like pastoral societies that are very they're very close to animal husbandry, and they're seeing traits emerge from the animals they breed. Because, like, you know, on a human scale, you only get to see that process iterate like once, you know, in your own lifetime, because your lifetime is one lifetime long. But like, if you're breeding, say, rabbits, you can see generations upon generations upon generations of that process. And, you know, while they're sort of explicit, articulated understanding of how all that worked, it is, you know, maybe off base or not the way we would understand it. The concrete outputs, like the things they say you should do, like it actually turns out that paternal age does matter. And you know, like, and all these sort of like, in practical terms, how should you do this? They're like actually pretty, like they've got a pretty good handle on it.
Yeah, and even Plutarch points this out. You know, he says, skipping ahead a little bit, for in the first place, in the second place, here we are. He saw much folly and vanity in what other peoples enacted for the regulation of these matters. In the breeding of dogs and horses, they insist on having the best sires, which money or favor can secure. But they keep their wives under lock and key. So why don't we get to this? So this is
yeah, let's do this.
Yeah. So, okay, he says, going on to, this is the wackiest part, famously, after giving marriage such traits of reserve and decorum, he nonetheless freed men from the empty and womanish passion of jealous possession by making it honorable for them, while keeping the marriage relation free from all wanton regularities. Let's not forget, this is not, you know, this is there's proper propriety here, to share with other worthy men in the begetting of children, laughing to scorn all those who regard such common privileges as intolerable, and resort to murder and war rather than merely just grant them. Or, you know, why fight the Trojan War when, you know, Menelaus and Paris could have just come to an arrangement with Helen?
Yeah,
right?
Just figured something out.
For example, an elderly man with a young wife, if he looked with favor and esteem on some fair and noble young man, might introduce him to her and adopt her offspring by such a noble father as his own. And again, so he's saying, you know, an old guy who's lost the mojo, let's say, could bring in a young man, and but he would, the old man, the husband, the legal husband, gets to keep the child. So
right.
Well, you know, if your goal is to have great children for the state, yeah, maybe there's a logic there. Conversely,
there's an element of go ahead.
Well, then conversely, a worthy man who would a worthy man who admired some woman for the fine children that she bore her husband, and the modesty of her behavior as a wife. I just admire you as a mother so much, right? He might, you know, approach the husband and enjoy her favors if her husband would consent, thus planting, as it were, in a soil of bountiful fruitage, and begetting for himself noble sons who would have the blood of noble men in their veins. So, you know, or the young guy can approach the older man and say, hey, you seem to have a great vessel there. And then he could keep the kids for himself without even having to get married, which is really interesting too, right?
Yeah, what a deal.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways that you can arrange this.
Oh man, yeah. Well, and it's sort of it makes you wonder about the malleability of desire, the malleability of what people are actually willing to accept as customary, right? Like, you know, you imagine yourself like in the young man's position, like the kids that like look like you, and they're being raised by, you know, the older guy, but like I gotta think that like on some level there's a natural thing taking place for you. Like those are actually my kids. And one of my biggest challenges, and this is probably just the challenge of reading genuinely ancient, genuinely alien writers and thinkers, is like, how different were we? Like were they actually like impossible for me to understand? Or are these like cultural like a cultural overlay that is to some extent hypocritical or to some extent perfunctory, right? Like, and I guess, you know, obviously all of these sources, like we're reading a Roman telling us about Sparta in a way that's sort of both Spartan and Roman propaganda. There's accretions there, and it's hard to know what's real.
Yeah, and it's an idealization, perhaps, but it seems that this is widely attested. It's not just Plutarch. Xenophon talks about it. Polybius talks about it. Philo talks about it. That they apparently really did engage in this wife swapping thing. Plutarch's explanation is interesting, and I think it goes to how malleable our values are potentially, but through ideology. And he says, as I've alluded before, in the first place, Lycurgus did not regard sons as the peculiar property of their fathers, but rather as the common property of the state, and therefore would not have his citizens spring from random parentage, but from the best there was. So, you know, this is an idea that Plato really takes up and leans into in the Republic, right? And where there's this, in the Callipolis, you know, complete obfuscation of who is the father of who on purpose, so that everybody sees the children as kind of the common property of the state. It seems like the Spartans weren't all that extreme. They like to talk about it in those ways, but you know, they still have inheritance. They still have families. I think you really have to use your imagination of how it really worked out in practice.
Well, and I almost think that like there's an element. So I mean, I've studied this question on the way it works now. Like why are we having trouble with fertility, and why are people choosing not to have families? And my intuitive like distillation of everything that I've observed is that it has a lot to do with our sense of our children as being part of us, and something like your family being something that belongs to you and that you belong to, and not in like a chattel like property kind of way, but like I am raising these children to be my children and to represent my values and be sort of a work of beauty, something, a spiritual thing that I am bringing into the world and cultivating, and I think that the absence of that is part of what because we're talking at Exit these days about like how are we going to invest in some of these like boomer businesses. Not to change the topic too radically, I'll tie it back. Like the situation of these boomer like manufacturing businesses right now is that they are not intending to pass this on to their kids. Their kids they either don't have kids or their kids are in a totally different line of work. There's no, it's not a generational thing they're doing. And it actually has like big ramifications for the way you make investments, the way you prepare for the future.
Yeah.
And so like a lot of what I see as sort of the failure of the society, the reason that we are failing to raise families is because we are really not thinking of them as families. Like maybe the Spartans sort of viewed them as the property of the state, and maybe our failure mode is we view them as sort of they're completely their own thing. They don't belong to us. We don't belong to them. It's sort of like sea turtles. They just hatch and they wander off and we never see them again, right? And I wonder if that is a sort of common thread. The idea that because they're not your own, you're not as invested in their success and their cultivation, except in the Spartan case, like you would have to be so ideologized, you would have to be so bought in to the structure of that state and it's empirically it seems like they were at least in the golden age bought into that ideology, but it seems like there's a cost to instead of riding the sort of natural circuits of loyalty and belonging and essentially the way that human parents relate to children in primates, the way they sort of tribe up, to replace that with this artificial top-down thing, perhaps as a contributor to the failure.
Yeah, it's really fascinating thought, and so they have, in the sense that the Spartans have their sons as common property of the state, has everything to do with the agoge, with the intense state-sponsored, but also privately funded on some level, training for boys from age 7 up, which is stuff for another episode, and I'll cover when I get to the life of Lycurgus on the podcast. But the crypteia and training together, sleeping together, they basically are in boarding school from age 7 up.
And crypteia is like your little gang, your
little gang, and you hunt down helots and you steal stuff, and the hidden rights or something would be the translation. So all this stuff is making them into these age hierarchy warrior strata, and so in that sense they're kind of common property of the state. But you also still have inheritance of estates, and this is where the system breaks down in Aristotle's view. And I wonder, now that I've heard you kind of go through this, it kind of makes me think that all of that all of that sense of like, this is my family, and what is mine as opposed to what is private as opposed to what is public, what is mine as opposed to what is the state's, kind of gets channeled into money instead of individual, family traditions or a sense of who your family is in distinction to other families, how we raise our kids in this family, which is, part of passing on what is distinctly you. Yeah, well, this will get into the Aristotle's talk about oliganthropy and why the whole system failed, and maybe we should turn to that.
Yeah, it would be difficult. Last thought on that, it would be difficult, I think, to have here's who we are as a family in the shadow of this overpowering ideological ideal. Mm-hmm. Like, because if you're distinct, that's just like wrong in this frame. It's like you should just be the best according to the terms that we've all described and we've all settled on. Well, in Bapp's thesis, which I think is in this respect recapitulating Nietzsche, he talks about how the creative flowering of Athens was only possible because it produced specimens that were capable of overpowering the frame in which they were developed. And it's like in the Spartan case, they created incredibly powerful people, but the frame was just stronger. There's times, I think it's Plutarch, who sort of makes fun of playing the flute. He's like, somebody who plays the flute is like stupid and silly, and why would you do that?
Right.
But like a lot of the creativity of the Greeks, like the Athenians, and their philosophy and their poetry and all that stuff is sort of like a diversion, an alternate channel. It's somebody who decided, I'm going to climb a different ladder than the guys who are, drilling with spear and shield and maintaining their six-pack. And it's not to say that those things are trivial or frivolous, but like that was the one path. It was just warfare, right?
Right.
And in order to create all this other stuff, you sort of have to have a breaking down of this intense pressure in one direction toward one particular ideal. And the Spartans, it seems like, just didn't have that, or didn't ever reach that point. Yeah,
and Aristotle, his main criticism or one of his big criticisms of the Spartan constitution that he admires in many cases for its stability, is that they only focused on one kind of excellence, which is military excellence, whereas there are other very important forms of excellence, especially, and he says Sparta flourished as long as it was at war, but once it had an empire, once it kind of won the game after the Peloponnesian War, it didn't know how to excel in peacetime, because they were just not very effective governors. I talk about this a little bit in the life of Lysander and Agesilaus, but they didn't cultivate the peacetime arts. And Plato talks for Plato, what that failure mode looked like, I think, is in the Republic, the degradation from the timocratic man, the man who lives for honor, which is the second highest kind of man after the philosopher, the man who loves wisdom. The degradation from timocratic to the oligarchic man, which is to say, the man who is the plutocrat, who only cares about wealth. Sparta is the paradigm case for that. That is really what many of the moralists see as happening to Sparta over the course of the 4th century. They get rich from their empire, and they win, and they don't know what to do with themselves other than to accrue private wealth. Their women are inordinately powerful in Aristotle's view, and in the view of many other moralists, because the men are constantly at war. The women are left essentially running the city when the men are away, and women, in the eyes of the moralists, tend to luxury and like to spend money on frivolous things. And so this is the basic weakness of Sparta, because they
see that with sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, they didn't really have they didn't have other things that they valued other than obedience to the state through the agoge and through the military lifestyle. And I think that maybe you could say that all of their sense of privacy was poured into just wealth accrual, or private luxury, and and kind of went to the women's the sphere of the domestic rather than the public, because it was forbidden in public to display wealth. It sort of takes out this culture of public honor in a lot of way, and you get something a lot cheaper. And
well, and you can see almost. I mean, it's almost proverbial with our own, our best are not like these people, but still, the most type A guys I know, the most driven, the most ambitious, the sort of proverbial failure mode of that is you win the game, and then it's just like, well, how high can I run this number up? How it's literally just, and when you're talking about like the ban on public conspicuous consumption, it's like he doesn't actually, because he's still a Spartan, he doesn't actually get to enjoy the the weekend at Cabo or anything. He doesn't get to, like, it's not really, the money is not to be spent. The money is just to keep score. It's just, purposeless, spinning wheels.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Whereas if you did have this personal sense of ownership of your family, of that as sort of the primary domain, well, then it's about the cultivation and the development of my heirs and their empire and what they're going to build, and making sure that they have interesting problems to solve. And anyway, you said you wanted to move on to Aristotle?
Well, yeah, in a nutshell, before we get to the Romans, Aristotle says the way that they failed is basically two things that happened, and that is the number one that he points to is the lawgiver at some point, and this debated when this happened, allowed for bequests and gifts of estates to be made. Now, it was always illegal at Sparta to buy or sell an estate, but and we're talking about landed assets, the only real form of investment for Sparta. I mean, Athens, they have ships and a merchant economy, but Sparta, you don't have that. It's a land empire. So you can't buy or sell property, but what you could do, there was a liberalization, and one of the more persuasive accounts that I read is this happened around the end of the Peloponnesian War, so around the beginning of the 4th century, 400 BCE roughly. You could give your daughter in marriage to whoever you liked. Or sorry, you could give your heiress, like a widow, like a father could give his widowed daughter in marriage to whoever he liked, or she could marry whoever she liked, instead of, say, a propertyless man. And what this allowed for is the combining of two estates, crucially. Mm-hmm. So if an heiress marries somebody who already has an estate, a first child, suddenly you get one less plot of land to divide among the Spartan warrior nobles.
Life finds a way.
Life finds a way, yeah. And over time, over generations, the number of properties had been concentrated a lot into the hands of fewer and fewer people.
Right.
And in order to keep your citizen status at Sparta, you have to have a certain property qualification, because you have to be able to afford to pay the state fee to send your son through the agoge. You have to be able to pay the dues for these basically private eating clubs that are one of the cores of Spartan male social life, the Syssitia or the Fiditia. And once you have this wealth concentration, you just have fewer citizens who can afford, and they fall into the ranks of the perioiki, or there's a few gradations that are kind of hazy in the sources, but basically they're not full citizens. And by the time you get to the Battle of Leuctra, there's 1,000 or less of them, from 10,000 in the glory days. So stark fall off over the course of a century and a half. And Aristotle attributes that basically to inheritance law. And he also points out, he kind of alludes to the fact that at some point, probably around the same time that the estates became inheritable, or bequeathable rather, to other families, you could also divide your estate among your sons. Say if you had 3 sons, because there was a state law that incentivized you to have more sons under Lycurgus, but if you combine that with divisible estates, then the estates just get chopped up, and this is one of the big causes of a flux in the noble classes that Tocqueville talks about with America, where in the European nobility, primogeniture was the norm. Keep the estate. The firstborn gets the estate. The second becomes a cleric. The third joins the military, whatever. But in America, the inheritance law by default, I think you can change it if you know, with a strong estate lawyer. By default, it's per stirpe, so equally divided among boys and girls. And so that has, as Aristotle points out, just generationally a huge effect on, you know, eroding the stable nobility and warrior class.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that they're concentrate. Well, and you know, you could see the ability to divide the state is almost necessary in the face of the consolidation from the bequeathing problem. But it's kind of
right.
like a patch on a patch, and it's, you know, wheels fall off eventually. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It ends up, the poor men end up dividing their estates, and the rich men end up snapping them up, and
right.
So you get oliganthropy. That's, I think, how the argument would go from Aristotle's
But people
perspective.
finding a way to express their, like when I said life finds a way, people finding a way to express their personal power and to override the objectives of the state. That seems significant there.
Yeah, and to build a legacy, and I mean, Coulange in the Ancient City talks about how the city is a kind of a federation. Well, the tribe is a federation of households, and the city, the polis, is a federation of tribes. You know, there's this fundamental, irreducible block that is the family unit, that a lawgiver like Lycurgus could put a lot in place to advantage the polis over the family unit, but there's always just going to be that natural tendency toward entropy if you've got this you know, centralized state, centralized planning apparatus of a state like that.
Yeah. So, well, what's interesting about that is it seems like most of what we know about Sparta is from Lycurgus. It's from that, like, sort of founding moment, and it's sort of hard to follow where they ended up, except from sort of postmortems by the Romans, right?
Yeah, well, by Aristotle too. He's got a great postmortem in the Politics. Plato has a long discussion in the Laws.
Okay.
Xenophon was a contemporary who lived in or around Sparta for many years. But, you know, essentially they're all, both Xenophon and Plutarch, who are our main sources for the Spartan constitution, Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus and then Xenophon's Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, they're trying to look back to this period of like the 7th century, so 2 or 3 centuries earlier, at this, what the Spartans claimed was this unchanging constitution passed down from Lycurgus, more or less. And so it's really hard to date a lot of the institutions. But you know, by the time this stuff is starting to be recorded with Xenophon, you know, Aristotle would say they're already in free fall. They're already in a period of decline by that time. Yeah.
Right.
And they're very secretive too, so it's hard to know what's going on there. There's a reason we don't have sources. Both they thought that writing history was contemptible slave stuff, and or, you know, soft Athenian
And what are you, gay?
wussiness.
You write history?
Right. Yeah. Or, you know, they just, you know, wouldn't let anybody get out and to tell about it. So or get in to do their research.
Fascinating. Well, should we
move on to Rome? Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
Well, I think the next stage that is really interesting in the kind of decline of population narrative in the ancient world is this famous moment where Augustus, so the adopted son of Julius Caesar, after the great Roman Civil War between Caesar and Pompey / Cato, Augustus rises to power. He eventually drives out his opponent Antony and defeats him at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. So that's around the time we are. And Augustus is famous for ushering in this transition from Roman Republic to Roman Empire to monarchy, and this happens through this incredibly bloody process of civil wars. And as a result of the civil wars, many scholars believe that this is well, the ancient sources talk about a kind of depopulation of the countryside, all of these people dying. There's been a purges of the nobility, so it's not just the fighting men, it's like the leadership has been decimated. And so Augustus is kind of faced with this problem. So the story would go that Rome needs more citizens. The peace of Augustus has come. The Pax Romana has come in, and it's time for us to rebuild. The wars are over. Augustus reigns. He's the restorer of the Republic, if you like. But he makes it illegal, or he starts to put in these incentives for marriage and child rearing around. Well, this is an interesting kind of process that we'll talk about, but yeah, pause for thoughts and comments if you got them at this point.
Well, yeah, it seems to me almost analogous to like World War I, World War II, which you could sort of, if you squint, think about as sort of a European Civil War, and the last time when like the nobility and the elite were like right there getting chewed up with everybody else, and this immense drain on the sort of the most energetic, the most youthful, the most I think there's even elements of temperament, like sort of people willing to sort of jump into the breach like that, and the mood of Europe, and to a lesser extent America thereafter, is kind of subdued and limited and conservative, and I think that really, like, one of the things that I've observed, I did a post on this a couple of weeks ago, but like the baby boom after World War II wasn't actually after World War II, it was right in the middle. People started having babies in the U.S. and Europe right in the middle of World War II, and not only in the countries that were winning. Like, it wasn't a peace dividend, it wasn't a victory dividend necessarily, although it was stronger in the States than in Europe. Places that were undergoing, and it wasn't a boom time economic thing, because places that were under severe rationing and severe restriction were also having this baby boom. It's more like, it's what you really see is it's more like this phenomenon emerges in the middle of the war, and then like the depredations of the defeat cut it off in the nations that lose. But it's not created by the victory. It's just lost by defeat in the countries that are defeated. And the best explanation that I can come up with for that is that there was something about returning to these conditions of, these primal conditions of constraint, and men get to go be violent in sort of going off to war and defend the family, and like that in itself, there's just this sort of erotic energy that emerges from that as men and women get to see each other in that role, and sort of access more fundamental and less conscious modes of being and making decisions. And so go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, a friend of mine, a mutual friend actually, was telling me about how his grandfather and grandmother like met the day before Pearl Harbor, like, and his father or his grandfather was like, conceived essentially on that very day, like, and so yeah, this is going on. I think it was like after the bombs hit, like they met that night, and
wow.
had a soiree, unmarried. But this happens a lot, I think, in times of great chaos and warfare. People aren't starting to like budget out. Okay, can we afford a kid now?
Right.
Okay, well, how much should we invest for his college fund? And it's just it's a lot more primal, and these like instincts take over. So
which doesn't suggest like a really desirable policy prescription.
Right.
It doesn't
Right.
point in any good directions. But
yeah, it doesn't point towards like, hey, if only we can increase the income of the Zoomers, that they're going to have more babies.
Yeah.
I mean,
make it
obviously
safer,
that would be a good thing to
make
do, but these things aren't really what drives reproduction, are they?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this kind of ties into one of the scholars' criticisms of a widespread criticism among scholars of the Augustan marriage reforms, is that they didn't work, or they were sort of more ideology than real assessments of a problem. It's not easy to get demographic evidence anyway, and there doesn't seem to be strong demographic evidence of population decline in Italy in the period that Augustus is legislating in. Who knows? But it is worth dwelling on a couple of the points. I think they're instructive for lawgivers all the same with regards to natalism. So interestingly, the first move that Augustus makes is right after he wins ultimate victory, Battle of Actium, 31 BC. 2 years later, he proposes these laws to penalize bachelorhood and to reward men the more children they have, up to 3, and penalize them for only having 0 or 1 children too. But the nobility pushed back violently. The Senate just sees this as an attack on them, perhaps rightly, and so he backs off. And he
Can you say more about that? Do we know what their arguments were, like why they were so mad?
Well, something that you can see in the poets, such as Catullus earlier in the century, is the Roman nobles are starting to, like, sexual mores are arguably breaking down. Marriage is not fun. You can have a courtesan, you can have a girlfriend, and you can live this flashy life like a young Sybaritic poet like Catullus. And in the wake of Augustus's first attempt at legislating, we have this poem of Propertius where he's addressing his girlfriend, and he says, this is Propertius 2:17, book 2, poem 17. He says, "Why should I provide sons to win triumphs for Rome? No one of my blood will serve as a soldier. You mean everything to me, Cynthia, more even than having children and continuing my line." So
Man.
Yeah, so I think very interestingly to compare with the post-war boom in America, this idea of romantic love, and let's have love and not marriage, and let's just be with each other.
You mean everything to me, Cynthia.
You mean everything to me, more even than my biological continuity, or at least the you can't have a legitimate heir with a courtesan. It wouldn't count in Augustus's legislation. And
it's that framing too. It's that framing of, why am I having children to go die in Rome's wars? Like,
right.
The breakdown of this ideological connection to the state, right? Like,
for some rich guy to send off to the Gatling guns,
Right. Which is not, I have a lot of kids and it has nothing to do with saving Social Security or Medicare, right? Like, it's which that's I mean, sort of one of the criticisms of natalism is that it's like, because we talk a lot about like the economic consequences of societies not having kids, and people sort of rightly are like, well, I don't like, why am I gonna sacrifice, in a woman's case, like my body, and in a man's case, like all this money and all this risk of to prop up the empire, to prop, like, what is that? Why would I do that? And I actually find that totally persuasive and compelling. I think it's completely right. It's just that's not the reason to do it, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's funny how much that rhymes. Like that poem could totally be like basically now.
Yeah. Just try to make me have kids, Elon. Yeah, we'll see.
My line dies with me. They love that line. They love to say that.
That'll show him. So eventually Augustus does, consolidate power, exile, and maybe kill a few more of his enemies, and he feels in a strong position to pass these laws in 17 BC or 18 BC. They're called the Lex Papia Poppaea. I guess it's one law, and no, it's the Lex Julia, which severely penalizes adultery, and there's another one, De Maritandis Ordinibus, to encourage marriage by members of the various classes of citizens. And interestingly, importantly, he passes these laws through his power as the tribune of the plebs at Rome. So he passes them through the popular assembly, because he endows himself with the powers of the tribune of the plebs. He gets, elected by fiction, I guess, rather than by senatorial decree. And the senators, including Tacitus later, interpret this as a kind of an attack on them. Divorce is widely practiced. The senators are not having a lot of children. It's seen as kind of like, destabilizing to have a lot of kids. You have to divide the inheritance. It's not
sort
fun,
of like
and so on.
Sort of like J.D. Vance's childless cat ladies thing.
Yes.
Saying we're run by a bunch of childless cat ladies, and then all the childless cat ladies who happen to run the government,
yeah,
have a problem.
That rhymes for sure. And so what some people have, and it's worth pointing out too that Augustus's legislation remained in force for 300 years after this. It was so like if you don't have children, you are not able to inherit. If you only have one child, you're only able to inherit partially. This is that clause alone is an indication that this is really aimed at the wealthy classes. Like,
right.
You start to feel the pain a lot more if you have a big estate. Also, he gives precedent in appointing people to provincial governorships to men who have 3 children or more. So, like, it starts to be very incentivized. It's not just disadvantaged not to have children. It's advantaged to have more children. And this is, again, pointing especially at the elite. But I think a really interesting interpretation of this is one of the things that Augustus is doing in taking over the Republic and the reins of power. He is one of the things he does is he privileges the equestrian class, which is kind of like the lower ranking elites right below the senators, the upper middle class, who are the businessmen, who are often retired centurions and veterans. The gentry of Italy are pouring into the equestrian classes. These are the people that are really competent, wealthy enough, but haven't had access to the highest offices and the highest positions of the state. And Augustus is drawing on these people who are predominantly from the countryside and old Roman virtues. And, all these city mores.
Or they own a...
and they family values. American flags. I want to have 5 children. They're not trying to run the State Department and eat their lobster risotto. They're like, the salt of the earth kind of people. That's how they like to imagine themselves, right? Sure. So part of this is, and also Antony, Augustus's opponent that he defeated at Actium, was this famous adulterer. He's sleeping with Cleopatra. He divorces his Roman wife to be with Cleopatra, and he doesn't have any legitimate children, and it's just degeneracy. And Augustus is fighting against this urban degeneracy of the effete senatorials, and let's return Italy to the the salt of the earth Sabines and the Italian gentry who get what it's all about. So there's a kind of an important ideological propaganda value to promulgating these laws. That's one, I think, convincing interpretation. Maybe they worked a little bit, but maybe it was mostly about really about a regime change of changing the elite and having a new set of kind of values that point to the fact that the people who are running Rome now deserve their position because they're from this salt of the earth kind of class of the equestrians who are now rising to prominence under Augustus.
Well, and what's interesting about that from that perspective of viewing it as a fundamentally about regime change and elite turnover, right? Is that it doesn't seem to have worked in the sense of sort of preserving or getting patricians to reproduce. But it does seem to have worked in terms of handing the regime over to a different kind of person.
Yeah.
Which, from the patrician perspective, is sort of the roots of the failure, right? Because the story of the failure is this story of admixture. People coming in, upstarts who sort of don't they don't have the old values. They don't have they don't sort of belong, and then it's eventually first it's these guys, these sort of up-jumped people, but then it's like foreign mercenaries, and who's even a Roman, and you got Vivek posted he posted a picture of the Colosseum, and he was like, Rome wasn't about race. Anybody could be Roman, and anybody could, we had Arab emperors and we had Algerian emperors, and it's like, no, you had Italians who were born in Algeria emperors, right. and then when you start to have legitimately foreign emperors, it's it's the tail end of the decline. It's not even the it's not even that they
the
Ostrogoths sort of caused the problem. It's the fruit of the decline, and so it's when you're talking about the effort to spin up this birth rate thing, it's very interesting to think of this as are you actually trying to get Kamala Harris's stepdaughter to have kids?
Right.
Maybe you're not. Maybe that's not of interest to you. Maybe you don't actually care whether or not Ella Emhoff has kids. Maybe it's just about taking these other people who are already having kids and saying they should be in charge.
Yeah.
Which, man, that's an interesting rhyme from the history. That's great.
I think that's the Augustus playbook, and it's
Yeah.
From that perspective, it was a success, I think, because the equestrians really do become the backbone of the administration, and the Senate just decreases in importance. It's not irrelevant, but increasingly it's you don't have to be a senator to run a province, or Seneca was an equestrian. He becomes one of the richest men in the Roman Empire, in addition to being a great Stoic. And it continued. The laws continued under Tacitus, who's writing in the reign of Trajan, early 2nd century AD. Tacitus talks about, under the earlier emperors up to Domitian, the laws against bachelorhood and having no children were a way of making money as an informer. So you get a reward for informing on a crime, and I have to think that it's a proportion of the estate of the person that that you get convicted. And so there are people who make it their full-time job to go around snooping around and exposing the childless. And Tacitus says this is an instrument of repression, quite obviously, right? That's the point of it. It totally changes your way of thinking about this.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Well, Do we have more on the Romans, or do we want to talk about the Christians?
Yeah, well, the Christians are Romans, so we can segue to them.
Okay. Yeah.
So I've been researching this, and I should have said this at the beginning, but this is all kind of preliminary research for my talk at Natalism, or for being a resource on this, because I've equally to you gotten fascinated in it from the ancient perspective. But one of the books that has been very influential in discussions of the demography of the later Roman Empire, or at least Christians' role in that demography, is Rodney Stark. His book, I believe it's called The Rise of Christianity. And essentially he's a sociologist who goes back to the history of Christianity and tries to come up with some social science models, including demography and population statistics, for explaining the rise of Christianity. And one of the things that he points to is that, given what most historians estimate is the likelihood of Christian population in the Roman Empire in around AD 300, so 20 years or so before Constantine legalizes Christianity, and it becomes, within a generation or two, the de facto state religion, even though it's not officially, paganism isn't officially outlawed until much later. But by 300, by Constantine's birth, let's say, 5 to 7 million Christians in the Roman Empire. So Stark says, all right, to get to that number from, 12 in AD 30 or whatever, you have to have an increase on average of 40% per decade in the size of the church, which is not, which kind of tracks with the growth of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, in the 20th century. About 43% apparently was their growth rate in the 20th century. So this, there's some comps for this. But to get there, he adduces many factors that are interesting, that such as Christians in the plagues, the Antonine plague that killed Marcus Aurelius in 180, or the Cyprian plague in 260 AD, that the Christians just tended to perform better, like survival-wise, in these plagues, because they took better care of their sick, and were willing to sacrifice a few lives in the kind of nursing of the sick, rather than just abandon them and go to the countryside and shun their relatives. And that this both gave them a population advantage and kind of was good marketing. That's just an example. He brings out many arguments, and we can get to that whole plague decline of population narrative in a little bit. But I think one of the fascinating. Maybe we could pause there and talk about. Let's finish the thread.
Yeah. Okay.
So the most interesting for our purposes here is his chapter on women in the early church. So women were, in Greco-Roman society, Stark argues, and I think he's got great evidence for this, essentially had a demographic disadvantage compared to men. A lot of the upper classes in particular, maybe this was more widespread, would prefer male children, as in many societies, and infanticide was widely practiced. Either exposure or just outright, doing away with the child. Reading through this stuff, my stomach is turning. I have 2 daughters, but this burden of unwanted children fell disproportionately on female children. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, abortion was not uncommon. It was dangerous and highly, very expensive, right? You have to have a doctor, so it's probably more of an elite thing. But they did practice abortion, and this was extremely hazardous to the health of the mother. I mean, it is today, but back then it was often fatal. They were, whether it was surgical or whether sometimes the mother would just take a sort of lower dose of a lethal poison, It's just terrible for women. And so one of the things that Stark argues is that there's just more women in the early church, because the early church, the Christian church in general, prohibited abortion and infanticide. If you take those two factors, you get way more Christian women by population than pagan women. And this is something that some of the Roman authors talk about. Cassius Dio talks about how in Rome, in his era, 200 AD, there are just a lot more men than women. Probably in no small part because of these sort of pressures on the population of women.
Yeah.
And so if you have more women in the Christian church, more of the women that get married, even to pagans, are going to be Christians. And so even, you can convert women directly. Women in religious movements often tend to convert at a higher rate than men. Perhaps 60 or 70% are of converts to a new religion are often women from comparative studies. So the primary conversions are often women, but then they often end up converting their husbands. And this is evidenced indirectly by many accounts of martyrs. Christian martyrs is often patterned, the pious wife and the pagan husband, and he wants to get her to sacrifice to the gods, and she ends up saying no and getting martyred. And so that's a factor. And if they're not having abortions and they're not practicing infanticide, they have a big population advantage when you can start to see, and a lot of scholars do look at the 3rd century in particular as a time of population decline, especially in the Western Empire. And the Christians would have had a big advantage from that perspective, and just outbreeding the pagans. And
in just sort of crude terms, the woman is the bottleneck, right? Because she can only have so many children, whereas a man can have as many as he wants, and so the sort of the head count of women matters a great deal to anything, any movement, any community,
right?
And I think also just from this maybe Roman perspective, like Roman moral perspective, as long as there's frontiers and wars to fight, then there's infinite women, there's an infinite female population. There's a lady somewhere, you just got to go burn down her village or whatever. And also just sort of the selection pressure that places on men, it just kills a bunch of them. And so the engine of Roman family formation and the sex ratio was sort of driven by this endless expansion, and when that expansion could no longer be sustained, you had this fundamental surplus male problem. And so so right at that moment, right?
I hadn't thought about this factor, and because this is true of Greek society and Roman society. For Greek society from archaic, classical, Macedonian, Hellenistic periods, Roman society, the expansion of the Republic. I mean, these are expansionist peoples with expansionist values, and they have a way of overcoming the pressure on inborn, the women that are born within the population, right? So those are depressed, and you're pillaging and whatever, and it's uncomfortable to talk about. But
but that's
they're getting a new influx.
Right.
They're getting a new influx of women,
and that also contributes to this phenomenon of cultural admixture, because you're bringing in foreign women, and your allegiances and connections, they're not as tidy as they would be if everybody was sort of getting married the way they ought to, peacetime. And so the Christians presented this critique, this rebuke of that whole paradigm in a way that people found in a way that was both just sort of practically effective, but that also people found morally persuasive. And in terms of managing plague, and it's like one of the things that this is maybe to complicate it or to introduce some nuance. There's that poem of a I think it's a Roman talking about a slave girl, and it's a little girl that is growing up in his household, and I think she dies, and it's this very moving, beautiful, he's just loved this little girl, and then you've got that burial of, I think it's a Roman girl, and she's got that laurel wreath. It's this relatively famous image. I think a couple people have it as their avatar on Twitter. It's this child's skull, so it's got the teeth, the permanent teeth behind the baby teeth haven't come in, and she's got this wreath of flowers, and it's like this little girl was buried in a way that just showed a lot of love and a lot of care, and so that to me indicates that it's just like our time, if an outsider were to describe our society and some of the things that go on and the way things are, I think that they would get an impression of us that we are a very hard and a very cruel and a very vapid and nihilistic people, right?
Yeah.
But there's all this. But number one, there's all these sort of articulated, stated criticisms of the way things are,
right?
And people who don't like the way it is and say they don't like it. But then there's also all this unspoken discontent that maybe if you don't even have words to describe why it's wrong, it's just wrong. And I think that's maybe what part of what happened with Christian conversion was. It was a lot of people who were just nah, this isn't right. We're not doing it that way. This other way is better. It feels more right.
I'm inclined to agree. I was getting dizzy reading some of these reports of ancient abortion. It's just horrifying, right? But this pattern of the women having a huge role in the growth of the Christian religion, to me, it's a very interesting kind of how it's been done in reverse, sort of with the rise of leftism that we've seen in the last election. How the leftist doctrine has seemingly disproportionately affected women, kind of like you would expect with a new religion kind of coming in and converting the women. And, it's almost like a witch's Sabbath version of the rise of Christianity. But, whereas with Christianity, the result was much more babies because, no abortion, no infanticide. With the modern version, it's the opposite, it seems.
Yeah. And I think if I could sort of bring it all together and put a bow on it would be, there are sort of healthy, and when I say natural, I guess what I mean is sort of resonant with people's natural desires, and they're in Bap's podcast, he's talking about this natalism issue, and in the context of criticizing it, he's not a prenatal guy. Mm-hmm. But he's saying if the society is dominated by people who are I don't feel like having kids, mm-hmm. or I'm not called to it, or it's not the kind of person I am, or whatever. It's like saying you don't want to eat, or you don't want to go to the bathroom, or you don't want to breathe. It's such a fundamental imperative that it's something's wrong with you. Something and maybe not with you as a person, but with the milieu, with the environment. And I think that a lot of what passes for pronatal policy discussion is largely nibbling around the edges of the incentive structure of kind of like the Aurelian things, where it's and by the way, the things that the Romans were doing to encourage fertility are would be totally post-revolutionary here. That's not going to happen within our present cultural or political paradigm. the extent to which having children was explicitly favored.
Yeah.
And so it's like, even in your dream case, even if you as a pronatal policy guy were to get everything you wanted, it still probably doesn't scratch the itch, probably doesn't accomplish what your intent is. Unless your intent, like with the Romans, is just to privilege a separate class of people. And so I guess going back to like the baby boom and the Christians and the Spartans, it's like, what is going to have to replace this antenatal spiritual and social and economic paradigm is a new paradigm. It's got to be a new way of thinking about our families and about our children and how we relate to them, that in my view it just has to be much more consonant with our the natural inclination to regard these things as our own, and to take ownership of our physical and cultural legacy. Right? Like these kids as instantiations of, and there's a narcissistic way to do that, right? That's like, my kids must achieve, so they reflect on me and all that. But there's also like, I am part of a chain of being. I exist to continue and improve this thing that we're all doing, me and my ancestors and my descendants. And so I have a responsibility to them to provide for them and give them a life that's beautiful and full and rich. And that, I think, can be a really compelling... everybody that I know who has kids, that's why they have kids.
Yeah, I think it has to square with your moral intuitions. It wouldn't hurt if the propaganda apparatus, whatever, what you want to call it, would care to deign to make it kind of glamorous, in the sense of a mutual friend put me onto this book, The Power of Glamour, Virginia Postrel. Like the way that images can make something desirable in particular, not like luxurious, not glitzy, but like, a lot of our desires are just mimetic desire. We want what we see other people wanting. It's just been, so problematized, so many stories of divorce and broken homes that get explored in the typical novels or the movies. It's like we're kind of like fetishizing dysfunction. I think that's another factor that could be improved upon. But again, it would have to be organic. And I don't know, I think I have some hope that in the current generation, we are moving in that direction of people, like there's a longing for that wholeness and for that sense of like ownership and legacy and continuing the human race, right? That can be celebrated in art also, in addition to squaring with our more rational moral presuppositions. There's this irrational part of it that's really important. They kind of go hand in hand. But to put a bow on the historical perspective, a lot of the conclusions that Stark makes are hotly debated among Roman historians, it should be said. And of course, I think academic historians, given who you and I know them to be, are going to be very skeptical of any kind of explanation that points to infanticide or abortion as an actual causative agent in population decline. Like, God forbid the Roman Empire might actually have fallen because that might have actually been a factor, right? It's almost inadmissible, prima facie. Yeah. But, it could be overemphasized by Stark. I don't know. I'm not sure one can know. But if it is true that there was a population decline in the 3rd century especially, whether through the plagues, because Stark estimates on, not super conservative, but also not super liberal side, they could have done away with a quarter to a third of the population of some regions, which is, that takes a long time to recover from. You get barbarians being recruited into the army to fill up the ranks, sometimes settled on Roman agricultural land to cultivate it. This starts to happen in the 3rd century. Well,
I was going to say that's the the solution to our fertility problem is just immigration.
Right.
Like, let's just make the big line go up, and it's like, well, but those aren't actually. They don't have any reason to have loyalty to us. They don't have any reason to participate in our thing. Like, it's not. That's just a fundamentally unserious solution, and it obviously did not work.
And I think the other story would be, well, maybe what worked often people blame the rise of Christianity for the fall of the Roman Empire, like it softened the military ideals. I think that's nonsense for a lot of reasons, but you could say that actually the Christians were responsible for propping up the demographic quality, for keeping it on life support for another couple of centuries, because the Western Roman Empire doesn't fall until 470. It continues on in the East until 1453. One final thing that I found really provocative and completely wacky is I found an article, I'll have to cite it, where somebody was arguing that IQ declined in the High Roman Empire, sort of in the 3rd century crisis, and it got boosted again under the Christian domination, because apparently you can discern IQ from DNA somehow. This was crazy to me, but I found it fascinating. It seemed like the sample size was a little small, but I'll have to find the guy's name who did this. But if you think about Christendom, especially affecting the elites who are more likely to want to control the size of their families, practice abortion, maybe there is something to be said for that argument. So I think thinking about how that Christianity might have played a positive development, both demographically and maybe even on an IQ level, is fascinating. So I intend to research this stuff more deeply by the time we get to the conference. But there's a lot to think about.
Well, I can't wait to hear about it at the conference. I think this is going to be a fascinating topic. There's going to be a lot of commentary. We're kind of structuring the conference as like talk and then unconference and talk and unconference, so that people have time to kind of respond and Q&A and then sort of confabulate with each other. And man, I just can't wait to hear how this bounces off of like the tech people and some of the trad people, and you're gonna bring something really, really great. So you guys can use offer code Cost of Glory to get 10% off your tickets. That'll be great. Really hope to see you guys there. And man, thanks so much for taking the time, Alex. Great to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure, Kevin. Thanks again.